disappear around boulders, these circles of boulders. People will just vanish. It's usually around twilight. And there's all these little weird details, like, they'll find people's shoes. They find their shoes all the time. It's often hunters. And I started looking at all this data, and I thought, this is really strange, because if this was just random stuff happening, why would you expect these clusters of data? Why would it always be around boulders? Why would it always be people who were, picking berries and, all these little weird patterns coming up? And the thing that really clicked in my mind is I realized that a lot of the patterns there, and also working backwards, a lot of the patterns in the alien abduction stuff are also patterns from mythology and different cultural lore from different cultures. I don't know if most people know, but fairies, seems like a really weird jump, but fairies in cultural lore aren't really like Tinkerbell in Disney movies. Stories about fairies involve these like strange lights luring people off the path, and people get like abducted by fairies, and they go to these, I'm talking about cultural stories and folklore and things like that, and they get taken to these strange realms where time passes really quickly, and they come back. And a lot of those details synced up perfectly with the missing 411 disappearances. People picking berries, that's a fairy thing. That's why if you go to certain countries, like in parts of Ireland, they'll say, you shouldn't pick certain plants. They belong to the fairies, Things like the boulders, these creatures are said to live in boulders and they abduct people. Hunters, people messing with the animals. Twilight, dusk is like a classic magical time where weird things happen. So it really accelerated my studies because I realized that all this stuff fit together in this weird cohesive framework, and that I wasn't really the only one who noticed it. There's other UFO researchers and people studying paranormal phenomenon who naturally look backwards and say, oh, look, these patterns are the same. How strange is that? And the reason it really kicked into high gear for me is my background doing psychedelics. To make a long story short, I've basically done as much, I would say I've gone as far down that road as someone could go without really altering their life drastically. Like maybe some people go live in some, weird compound or something. I didn't do that, but I did, a lot of DMT, ayahuasca, and things like that. And it's just relevant because I don't know if everyone knows this, but the thing there is that DMT itself is essentially the most powerful psychedelic that exists. It's tiers beyond, like levels and levels and levels beyond other psychedelics that have been in our culture or in other cultures. So that in and of itself is interesting because right now it's breaking so hard in the culture. I keep up with it. I don't know if other people do, but it's so normal that even people like Lindsay Lohan and Vice Media, everyone's talking about ayahuasca and DMT. It's everywhere, basically. So you have to ask yourself, if you look back at the 60s and the 70s and the big effect, acid and things like that had on the culture, right now you're basically at the beginning of the wave breaking of something much larger, which is DMT and ayahuasca being released into Western culture wholesale. I mean, Joe Rogan has like the most popular podcast in the world, right? And he talks about it all the time, tells people to do it, they should do it. So I think the effects of that are just starting. And the reason that it is relevant, again, to everything I just described working backwards, is that the hallmark of those experiences, people doing DMT, doing ayahuasca is basically orally active DMT, kind of just going through this quickly. We can go back and I can elaborate on anything, but just to paint the whole picture, make it not this weird, like, kind of schizo web. The point is that those experiences are characterized by being transported to other worlds, interacting with entities. It's a totally, fully immersive psychedelic experience. Like if you've seen cartoon shows where someone does drugs and everything, they go to some other world and something and people say, oh, it's not really what drugs are like. That's actually what like DMT and ayahuasca are like. So the point is that I had built up all this, understanding of how these other phenomena are related via these archetypes and themes and patterns. And I realized it's the same exact thing as DMT and ayahuasca and those patterns. And it just forms this really strange picture that I feel like I am almost at the tip of the spear of putting together, not because of some like great knowledge I have, just because of by virtue of having walked through these different rooms. Not many people, I think, have gone through all the different rooms that I've gone through at this point, because it's just really strange that when people are taking this drug that's from the Amazon rainforest, I mean, people talk about seeing aliens, the patterns from fairy lore and things like that. So I'm kind of just going through it quickly just to make sure that I sort of paint the whole cohesive web, because for me, that's where I'm standing, and that's where a lot of my work is in kind of trying to figure out, like, what's the deal with that? Why is it that when people do these, like, newer in the sense of being now placed into our culture, psychedelics, it forms this perfect tapestry with all these other weird paranormal phenomenons, like people seeing the same things, the same sort of themes running through them. And I really started to realize that the only way I could really explain all of this is within a larger, like, theological framework. And all of a sudden it made perfect sense. If you look at all the missing 411 stuff, you literally can't explain it in terms of physical phenomena. You can't look at someone who literally just vanishes from the earth and try and explain it in terms of purely physical stuff. It obviously is something super physical. It has this super physical spiritual component. Same deal with the UFOs. You can't really explain it in terms of purely physical phenomenon. And yeah, basically a big part of my breakthrough, I guess you could say, and I wrote this whole thing that's basically a longer version of what I'm describing right now, painting this whole picture of all this integrated together, is that all these things have like a spiritual dimension to them. And I think, not to be too dramatic, to shove it in this large nutshell, but I really think it has to do with like spiritual warfare and spiritual evil and good battling for the attention and control and fate of humanity. Not to be over dramatic, but you mentioned the UFOs and why would the government disclose it and things like that. Now I see things like that in terms of this larger picture, in terms of turning people's attention towards whatever is going on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, at the same time, this big push to legalize marijuana, which is brand new.
Yeah, totally.
Brand new, just happened.
Yeah. Totally.
Now, another thing, too, you had mentioned, too, about missing 411. Back in Nevada, there was this fascinating case where this group of hikers, I think it was 3 of them, took all their clothes off, folded them up neatly with their shoes on top of their clothes, and then disappeared. And what they try and say was, and at the time I kind of believed this, they said that when you're dehydrated and you're getting heat stroke in the desert, you think if you take your clothes off and you run real fast, it'll cool you off. Now, I don't know how they can come up with that.
Yeah, that's pretty common. Yeah, people who, I don't know, in the desert, I guess you would get hypothermia in the desert, but yeah, the last stage of it is I think it's that you feel really, really hot and that you want to desperately, like, remove your clothing and then to try and, like, get rid of the hot, but it's actually an illusion because you're, like, super cold, yeah.
Back to you for a minute. Now, are you living in isolation right now, or are you living with like a family or a girlfriend or something?
No. I have a wife, I have a dog, and things like that.
Okay.
But, I like to say that basically I have one foot in normal life to the extent that I don't want to say have to because I love it. Love my wife, love my dog, and everything. But then everything else is all my energies and everything with the art, writing, all of that is basically dedicated to kind of just figuring out what the deal is with all this stuff. Not like this stuff. I mean, the way we've been talking so far, it makes it sound like I probably have my walls covered in like UFO documents. It's not really like that. That's just a nice node to hit to illustrate it. How all this stuff figures into, good and evil, the rapidly changing like world that we live in. Because I think a lot of people just think like, oh, the world changes. That's kind of how it is, But I don't really see it that way anymore. I think that the larger worldview shift is somehow hooked into all these little weird bits of data and evidence and kind of trying to get more people to just also look at it and figure it out with me because I'm not some, Da Vinci-esque genius. I think that right now we're kind of at the, like I said, tip of the spear where people are going to start realizing something's kind of up with like all this new age stuff and why do I go to, this store at the mall to buy clothes for my sister and there's like tarot cards here? Isn't that like kind of weird? And I turn on Vice News and they're telling me to do ayahuasca and BuzzFeed News is telling me to like try DMT. Like something's clearly going on. It's not all just random basically.
And these bizarre ceremonies at the halftime show and at the Grammys and stuff that was with Baphomet.
Yeah.
Something's right in your face,
Exactly. And then everywhere you turn, you hit this, it's like there's a vector towards this dark energy, this dark symbolism that I wrote off for a long time. I thought, maybe it's just a coincidence. It's just, people being weird. I was in the art world, so people, like weird symbols and things like that. But I really do think that there's like spiritual forces at play for sure.
Oh, yeah, because some of this stuff is embedded very, deeply, so that you don't even notice it, Now, I forgot what I was going to ask you. Like even the music industry too. Now, do you think, again, this Satanism is this by design, like Satanism?
Well, yeah. The question of like if it's by design is very interesting. I think that in general, most people are kind of loaded to put it into a binary. It being, anything. a binary of, well, either there's a bunch of people in a room planning this out, or it's totally random. I don't really see it that way. I think that most people are influenced almost like, not to sound like Illuminati-esque, it's not like that, but almost they're influenced, like puppets on a string by their worldview and how they see things. That's the case for me. It's the case for everyone. So when you see some music video, let's say, where someone, one came out recently and it made sort of a big stir online where someone's like, dancing, they're like giving a lap dance to like Satan or something like that. Literally, by the way, it's so absurd. And you can ask yourself, why is that? And some people would say, well, this guy works for the music industry. Someone obviously told him to, put this devil imagery in his video. Maybe that's the case, yeah. But I think it's more that the momentum and energy is so loaded towards things like that it sort of just naturally happens. I mean, I would say I see the larger shift in terms of the Christian worldview basically taking a back seat. I mean, we live in like a quote-unquote, post-Christian world, as much as I dislike it. And the question people should ask themselves is, what's replacing that? If we live in a post-Christian world, what's replacing it? It's not nothing. And it's this strange hybrid of sort of the other thing, I guess, that's a part of my work, I guess you could say, is it's a really strange hybrid of occulty stuff, occult energy, occult views and things like that, with what I guess I would call a sort of scientific atheism. And those two things seem like they should be the worst enemies. It seems like, weird ideas about crystals and magic and astrology and things like that should be the number one enemy, right, of scientific atheism. Like, one's rational, one's mystical. They should be opposing, right? But they're really not. They really go together, actually, to make one cohesive worldview. And you could go back in history and document that. I mean, if you go back even, like, to the birth of all that stuff, and, like, not the birth, but in our culture, one of the big nodes of it in the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance wasn't just a birth of like humanism and rationality. There was also the occult and esoteric stuff having a reflourishing. One of my favorite little examples of that is this guy, Pico Mirandola. He wrote the first treatise on humanism. It's a whole thing about humanism. It's like the Humanist Manifesto. But he also got excommunicated from the church for being like a Kabbalist, and working really hard with occult magic and stuff like that. So in a weird way, I think that also contextualizes sort of a long walk, but the music industry and all that stuff. It's like it's loaded with all these different building blocks of like atheism, which is inherently anti-Christian, occult stuff. Everyone thinks occult stuff is so cool. So when I see stuff like that, I think of it more as like a symptom rather than the cause. That's how I would say it. It's more like the society at large is infected with something. And then I'm like, well, yeah, of course, when you turn on MTV, people are like killing each other and, simulating sex acts with the devil. Of course that would happen. Because
or Adult Swim, a Cartoon Network, Adult Swim, which is involved with Kenneth Anger, by the way. Let's not look at that. Now, I don't even have time to ask you a question. We're totally out of time. We got about 1 minute and 40 seconds. What would you like to leave us with?
What I would like to leave people with is you have to ask yourself the question of, what is this new, strange worldview that everyone seems to suddenly be a part of? Is it atheist? Is it magic? What's the deal? It's kind of this weird thing that has no name yet, and we have to name it so we can figure out what the implications are and how it's going to play out long term.
Owen Cyclops, thank you so much. You can be found on Twitter at Owen Broadcast or Owen Cyclops. His Patreon is Owen Cyclops. And his website is owencyclops.com. And once again, what's the name of that YouTube channel?
On YouTube, it's Opening Painting Show. But yeah, the best hub is on Twitter. It's at Owen Broadcast. If you're not on Twitter, just go to my website, owencyclops.com. That's how you can find me or keep up with me.
Owen, thank you so much.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
Good night.